Well, in a modern world, data is one of the most valuable assets that we can have. So we have a fantastic panel joining us now. We have Carla, who's a managing partner at a law firm focused on technology law and is also a criminal law professor at one of the leading law schools in the Philippines. We have Matthew Sherry, who is technology specialist at KPMG, particular focus on emerging technologies like blockchain and AI, and also Taha, who is helping enterprises in digital transformations really drive, build and innovate solutions. So it's fantastic to have you all join me today on the line. Thank you so much.
Nice
Thank
to
you
be
for
here
having
too,
us.
Jess. Hi, Matthew. Hi, Taha.
Thank you for having us.
You're
Yes.
very welcome.
Hi, Matthew.
Now, I want to jump in and start with talking about data confidentiality, because in the past 3 to 4 months, we've seen a complete paradigm shift. COVID-19 has really shaken up multiple number of sectors, and we have had to see this move digital for a lot of companies and industries that maybe were slightly unprepared. I want to start just by asking, and I'll start with you, Carla, from your perspective, what kind of things did we see that maybe didn't perform as it should, maybe security or data breaches in light of COVID-19 that was negative for the sector?
I think as far as this pandemic was concerned, and I'm going to speak with the Philippine setting in mind, we weren't as digitalized as other countries. So the concept of working at home was something that was close to being alien to most of the Philippine companies here. That's why most of the time it was their own personal devices that they were using. And given that, all the security protocols that their companies had didn't necessarily apply to these. And that's just the beginning of the mountain of problems that happened. One more thing also is that as compared to Europe, even though we do have our own data privacy law, it's not as, well, I would hesitate to say that it's not taken as seriously, but I would have to say that that's the case. And so a lot of people here don't even think that the GDPR applies to the Philippines. And all of us here know that that's not the case, right? So I think it's more of the lack of preparation and information about the threats that are actually happening. And it caused some problems, I would say, but it is a good learning experience for everyone.
Definitely need to onboard a lot of information very quickly to be able to adapt. So Carla's given us the Philippine perspective there. Matthew, I want to turn to you from the European perspective, as you are based here in Malta. How did you view the situation?
I think in Malta we're very well set from an infrastructural perspective, at least. I mean, and even the digitization of services, we've had, you know, even if you look at the government, for example, we've had, they've been digitized for quite a number of years already now. But I think I also draw parallels with what Carla was mentioning, in the sense that I feel like education is still always the number one problem and the number one issue here. I think we've seen a number of issues arise in the fact that people were essentially panicked when this struck. You know, there were a number of organizations that actually weren't very well prepared, even if they had the technology and they had the investment in place. They weren't necessarily very well prepared to actually shift at a short moment's notice onto this. So what did we see? We saw organizations that were trialing different online collaboration platforms, left, right, and center, without actually knowing the implications of using one over the other. And that's all of these actually create attack vectors to malicious attackers, and they actually play right into their sort of trap, so to speak. So yeah, I think there were, as Carla said as well, it was, and I feel like it still is a massive learning experience for everyone, not just the technology industry itself. I think industries across the board where, you know, it's like we're always talking about disruption and embracing disruption. All of a sudden, you have no other option. It's either embrace disruption or else, you know, you're gone for good. And I think when faced with that fate, a lot of organizations said, okay, we might as well embrace disruption to see what we can make out of this. At least that's what I felt. You know, the sort of European perspective was, but there was still a lot of panic and unpreparedness, I felt.
And I'm sure some industries even created solutions that maybe surprised themselves and the sector that they were working in. Taha, I want to turn to you now and just ask, are you able to give us any examples? There were some real security breaches that we saw in the past few months that even hit headlines that were sheer magnitude of just how this COVID-19 situation has forced people to move online. Are there any that you're able to explain to our viewers?
Yes, exactly. So first of all, I would like to tell, most companies are not able to figure out what GDPR actually is and what's the consequences of the breach. So now they are once because now we are seeing over in this digital age, companies are moving towards digital transformation. So there are more attack surfaces which are being opened, and there are more devices. Let's say before we were not talking about IP devices and IP address and handset devices which comes under GDPR. So now once we are embracing digital transformation, there are more metrics which can be comprised as GDPR. So what we are seeing, we have seen the famous Zoom that we are, using that, it comes under attack. They were not, having adequate security measures which they should be having it. So which resulted in, security breach. And then we have seen, we have seen many healthcare companies which are experiencing the data breach of protected health information. So they are also, and if you're talking about airlines as well, we have seen EasyJet Airlines, which cannot be able to protect their customers. And once and the issue is that once companies able to understand the attack vectors, they don't know that what are the consequences of this breach. So let's say people who will be watching is if I'll tell you, the breach of this GDPR, if you're not being able to comply with this, you can lose 4% of your global revenue. So you have to take proper measures, safeguarding it. Yeah.
And what's really shocking about this, you mentioned the healthcare systems, EasyJet, where customers' information there is pretty much all of their valuable information and data. So these are huge industries, huge sectors. You would expect them to be better prepared. So I'll ask this to the group, and anyone is free to answer. Was anyone surprised at the industries that we did see that were hit from these data breaches? Was there any feeling that they should have been better prepared?
Honestly, I'm sorry if I jump in.
No,
I really wasn't that surprised, because just because an industry is big doesn't necessarily mean that they have the proper protocols that they are supposed to have. I think the major problem with a lot of companies, especially if they feel that they have some sense of cybersecurity, I think the wrong thing about it is they assume that if all protocols are into place, a cybersecurity threat or hack will never happen. And I think the better attitude would be to assume that it'll happen at one point in time, rather than think that, no, it will never happen to us. Just assume that it'll happen. That way, you'd be able to evolve whatever security protocols you have. So I don't necessarily equate a big industry with respect to having the same or the great security protocols. It could happen to anyone. You'd be surprised to know that bigger industries sometimes are the most lax, simply because they think that they have everything that's necessary in order for them to operate.
Yeah,
So you go ahead.
I actually dare say it's the other way around. I think it's easier for startups and for smaller organizations to be agile and nimble and to be able to adapt to this new reality. Whereas in larger industries, often the policies and the mechanisms you have in place don't allow you to actually move quickly. And I feel like that's what we actually saw play out, because if you're talking about the big organizations, even companies like, for example, Microsoft, who I think did a good job, because they actually had a platform, Microsoft Teams, for example, which they pushed for, and this was the right opportunity for them to actually showcase it. But they actually ended up in a situation where they realized that there were certain limitations that they had on their backlog that they actually all of a sudden needed to prioritize. Whereas if you look at smaller organizations, like, for example, Zoom, all of a sudden it shot up because it was able to check out features much faster. Never mind the issues that were, that were underlying the different technologies, because at the end of the day, one was able to adapt much more quickly than the other. At least that's what I feel like. But I think that's natural in big organizations vis-a-vis versus smaller organizations. At least that's the way I see it. I think it's quite normal.
And if we look at the situation now moving forward, and Taha, I'll start with you here, what kind of procedures then can be put in place? Because I'm sure everyone could agree that we hope a situation like this doesn't happen again, but there has been lessons that have been learned. So are there some key takeaways that small to medium-sized enterprises that are looking to ensure that their data safety is secure, what steps can they take?
Yeah, that's a very good question actually. Okay, first we need to understand about what it means to have a secure system and what it means to protect your security. Because imagine that if you are a digital transformation company and you are making $1 billion a year, and if there's a lawsuit which you can have it in form of non-compliance, or somebody can use your network to attack somebody else, it can cause huge damage to your enterprise. So first of all, we need to consider security which is by design, okay, rather than an afterthought practice. So that's what you have to develop a security culture. Then we say that no design can be 100% secure. Okay, so you have to do your due care and due diligence, and you should be considering security as a continuous process. So you can do something like vulnerability assessment or vulnerability analysis, in which you can measure, like you can perform the gap assessment of your nodes, and then you can see that where are you lacking, and you have to also make in place, like what sort of data you are saving. So let's say that once you are developing the culture, you are doing some gap assessment exercise, then you need to have the classification of data, that what sort of data is more crucial to you, what sort of data you cannot compromise on, and then you have to place adequate security controls to protect that data. So that's some of the major techniques.
Thank you. And Carla, I want to turn to you now and just ask you, so is there anything that I'm sure you had a lot of clients that were potentially asking for advice during these uncharted waters over the past few months. Was there any advice that you were able to give to them just to ensure that they were keeping secure and as safe as possible?
My advice to my clients was fairly simple, because at the end of the day, you have to start with being able to do the simple things. The problem here was that people didn't have enough information. They didn't know what they were supposed to do. They didn't know what they weren't supposed to do. So it was one thing to actually tell them what they're supposed to do, but I kept emphasizing, write it down, have a list of what you guys are allowed to do with the data and what you guys aren't allowed to do. Get rid of that hierarchy where, let's say, staff employees feel that they can't approach the data protection officer immediately in case they have questions. So I was telling them, in case of doubt, ask questions. Because that's the only way for people to be able to prevent a problem from happening. Most of the time, it's because people, try to wing it simply because they weren't properly informed. So that was, there were a lot of advice that I gave, to be honest. There was virtualization, there was making sure that, your data was backed up. And I was telling them, you know what, you so like the cloud, you say that you use Amazon Web Services, and then you put it in Google in the same region. Why not put it in another region just in case one region shuts down? Those kind of things. But for me, as a technology lawyer, since I'm not a developer or anything like that, I was telling them, you have to train the people. They have to make this a habit. It has to be a culture. Because even if you bombard them with so many technical terms, if they do not understand what these mean, then nothing will come out of it. And as what Matthew said earlier on, it is a learning experience for everyone. And in the same manner that it is a learning experience, it is also the responsibility of the business owners to actually teach. The business owners should learn, and they should in turn teach these to their employees if we want to be able to cope with the changing times. A lot of people say that, let's disrupt, let's do this. As what Matthew said as well, it's so easy to talk, but to actually apply it is a different thing altogether.
And you're right, Matthew, you said something really interesting earlier on, which was that the larger corporations, it might actually be more difficult for them to implement stable structures and processes because they are less agile than these smaller companies. And if we look at things moving forward, in the past 3 to 4 years, technology has increased and advanced massively. We've seen things that would not have been possible. how are companies able to continue to be agile as this industry does grow? If we look at things moving forward, what kind of sectors could pose to be a real threat to corporations? What kind of technology as well?
I don't think there's one. I mean, I'm going to jump in here, Jessica. I don't think there's actually one specific industry or sector, because I think each and every sector is open to disruption and open to getting disrupted. And I feel like that's often when the biggest and most, and when the loudest disruptive forces take place. Actually, it's when you have industries that think that they can't get disrupted, and all of a sudden, if I go back quite a few years now to come up to show an example that that's been in place, and I think that everyone is sort of familiar with. The hospitality industry didn't feel like it could be disrupted with technology, but then Airbnb came along, and all of a sudden, things started changing. They started asking for certain regulation, so on and so forth. So I think, this actually can happen across the board. What I feel like is something that a pandemic essentially will propel forward is disruption in the healthcare industry, and potentially even in the tourism industry now, given that essentially there's been a reset switch pressed on this industry, and even a lot of very big and established players essentially are either on their back foot or are starting almost from, in some cases, starting from zero is actually the best you can hope for at this point. This, I feel like, creates an environment where this sort of disruption with innovative companies that can actually apply technology in a manner that actually drives real value rather than just for fluff, as I like to say, is I think we're going to see a lot of that. And personally speaking, as a technologist, as a geek, I'm quite excited for that, and I'm quite keen to see what we're going to have in 5 years from now.
So if we take the technology sector as an example, because it's a fantastic example, especially when we look at how valuable people's data is, healthcare records is something where I'm sure people would really like to see more investments when it comes to ensuring that those records are kept secure. What kind of technology would you expect to see automated or put on a blockchain? What kind of aspects of the healthcare system would you expect to see revamped based on what you understand from the tech sector?
I'll try to be quick and brief. I think when we're talking about technologies such as blockchain, something like this has actually showed that it's important for different players to be cooperating with one another. So I think that is where technology so far has been very, very much siloed, and I do think that something like blockchain can actually create the environment where these different organizations can actually effectively interact with one another, and in a secure way. And I'll leave it at that. Sorry, Carla.
No problem. For the Philippines, as I've said, we aren't especially in the healthcare industry, there are a lot of areas wherein technology could play such a crucial role. Just telemedicine, just being able to do like online appointments. It's as simple as that. So honestly, I am excited for the healthcare industry here in the Philippines, because something like this pandemic certainly opened people's eyes to see how technology can actually make things so much faster, so much safer, and so much convenient for everyone.
Fantastic. And now,
to add over here,
Tal, please go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. With this in the blockchain, if we are using, but we should also be, we also be careful that with the use of technology, we should not be, breaching the data. Okay, let's say that if you are, doing some authentication mechanism using customer data, you should, saving it in the form of encryption, or you will be saving the personal data on offline storage while using blockchain, So that's two things very important. And I see that, within blockchain in the healthcare industry, supply chain is one domain in which we can, have the tracing in which we can have the tracing end to end. And we should be making sure that if we are having the tracing or once you're, having the data transfer, it should be encrypted end to end. And we should be able to cover all the touch points of the data. So that's 2-3 areas.
Great, thank you. And now I do want to kind of turn this onto a positive ending note. If we look at the technology that we've been discussing today and the fantastic potential that it does hold to future shape numerous sectors, not just the tech sector, but every single industry alone. If we look at the pandemic that we've seen, if this was to happen in 2 to 3 years' time, how would emerging technology, how would this play a better role in making the situation easier for these individual sectors? Is there certain things that we would expect to see that would have played a more prominent role, be it quantum computing, be it blockchain, would it be AI automation? Matthew, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure about the timeline, so I genuinely hope that this doesn't happen again within the next 5 years at least. But I think once quantum computing becomes, for example, a lot more prevalent within the medical research industry, I think that in and of itself is going to help us discover vaccines much quicker, and in a much more, in a safer way, and in a much more agile way as well. And I feel like something like that will actually, at the end of the day, that is the sort of globally understood end to this whole predicament. But I think even if we draw parallels between this pandemic and previous pandemics, the fact that we had technology so sort of integrated within the fabric of organizations, it already, even if we're talking about all the problems that were faced, it actually allowed a number of industries to at least keep trundling along. So I genuinely think that, if something like this happens again, or rather when something like this happens again in the future, we will be able to adapt to it with the advancements in technology in a much quicker way. I just genuinely hope that certain lessons that we've learned, not necessarily from a technological perspective, but more from a humanity perspective during this pandemic and even during previous pandemics, we'll actually, not forget them and we'll repeat the same mistakes. That's because sometimes I fear that that's what we're programmed to do as humans, unfortunately.
Absolutely, and also the fact that everyone was at home, locked in their own environment, it meant that it was really in people's faces. They couldn't ignore the situation that they were in. Carla, I want to ask if you have anything to add to Matthew's points, if you agree, or what's your thoughts?
I would definitely have to agree with what Matthew was saying. And just this thing that we're doing, if and hopefully not a pandemic again happens, the fact that people are now so used to video conferencing, using different platforms to be able to do things that everyone thought one had to actually be present for, that in itself eliminates, a probability of infection and contamination. So I guess it's not really the timeline, is what Matthew was saying, because technology will always be there. It's always developing. There will always be new situations. And everything that we're experiencing now is adding to the preparedness that we will have if ever that happens again. Because imagine if this happened years ago when there was no internet, right? It would have been different, definitely. So, I mean, that's all that I can say about that. But at the end of the day, hopefully something like this can be avoided.
And Carla, just to add on to that, are you also expecting that from a compliance perspective that we are going to see more legal processes that are in place so that information is stored differently, so that as companies are working from home with valuable information, are we going to see different regulations come into place surrounding data?
Oh, for sure. Because even now, we are now allowed to actually send things via email to the court. And of course, attorney-client privilege, everything. The data isn't supposed to be, disclosed to anyone else. A lot of law firms here are now doing their best to be compliant, because it's not just Asia that we have to be dealing with. It's not just the Philippine Data Privacy Act. It's the fact that there's the GDPR, there's the PDPA, there are so many laws. And now it's highlighted because everyone is suddenly on their computers storing data. Even meetings are being conducted over the computer, over the telephone, or over the mobile phones. So it's a different thing altogether. And I am expecting the Privacy Commission here in the Philippines to be much more active when it comes to, making sure that everything is appropriate or is proper.
Fantastic. Well, it was great to hear from you all. Thank you three so much for sharing your insights today. It was an absolute pleasure to get you all on the line from your respective countries and share your insights as well. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Taha.
Thank you.
Thanks.